Hi, class. This is the lecture for the Robert Nozick reading on distributive justice. First of all, we're reading from a very important, groundbreaking work called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. If you want to read like where the philosophical groundings for libertarianism and in a lesser sense uh, conservatism generally came from, not the religious stuff, but fiscal conservatism. Uh, it's pretty much it. It's super important, super influential. We are only reading part of section 1 of chapter 7, but there's a couple other interesting things in there since I linked you the whole text. Chapter 1, you get pretty important arguments about the morality of taxation, actually, and how it impacts rights. And then later in chapter 7, after where we stop the required reading, you also get his explicit rejection of Rawls, which might especially be very useful if you're looking at the case studies with these two. So it's in there. I will say it was published in 1974, though, which means we get a somewhat naive and idealistic and oversimplified version of socialism and communism, which we still get in popular media today, but it's before these countries opened and before there was a whole lot of communication and more speculation in state TV. So just bear that in mind. But otherwise, I don't think this lecture video should be too long, as we're really only covering a few main ideas out of the Nozick, but the really important ones. Uh, if we are talking about distributive justice, we have to talk about what Nozick calls justice in holdings. When is it okay to have my stuff? Because ultimately, uh, distributive justice must address holdings. And his answer is an interesting one. Notice it comes in three parts, and the reason for those three parts becomes apparent. The first two he's going to say are just this: in a perfect world, in an ideal world. And these first two parts are justice in acquisition and justice in transfer. So justice and acquisition, I want to be very clear about this, only applies to unheld things. It's not justice in how I acquired it, if, say, I got it from the grocery store, but justice in terms of how the first person got it. And so it only applies to things that have not been held. And that must be done justly, obviously. It must be done properly. If we've done this, we've achieved justice in acquisition. He doesn't spend a lot of time in this chapter talking about what that is, but they tend to be somewhat no-brainers. The second one, though, is, well, once we have it, almost nothing's new. Instead, it is transferred from one to another. So even if you think of wealth as transferring, even if this particular jacket didn't transfer. So the second requirement is that there has to be a proper transfer of these holdings. And if that's achieved, that's called justice in transfer. And again, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time teasing this out exactly in this chapter. But he's saying it does have to meet this standard. And of course, everybody thinks this. And these two, by the way, are pretty much, I wouldn't say no-brainers, but they're pretty standard. Like he's not saying anything crazy here. Well, of course, if I'm just in holding my property, whatever that property is, it has to have been, if it was justly acquired in the first place and justly transferred to me, well, what's the beef? There is no beef. Well, maybe. But, and he pauses there and says, well, look, this is all we would need in an ideal world. That is, if no one had ever acquired anything unjustly. If nobody had ever stolen or swindled or snuck a fast one or misrepresented, then these two would be enough. Obviously, we don't live in that ideal world. And in fact, if he just stopped there, he would be talking about an utterly useless theory of justice because it just doesn't obtain. We know it doesn't obtain. Try to think of one instance where you can actually trace property back and it's never been stolen or swindled or anything like that. So obviously that doesn't apply in America, where the vast majority of lands were taken from their rightful owners and things like this. And so we need this third criterion that can't be the ideal world. It must be in the real world. And it must be grounded in history. And that is what he calls his principle of rectification of injustice. By the way, we're not going to get into it in this course really, but that's the whole romp, is what counts as just given previous injustices is a really tricky question. Um, think about how we're dealing with Native American land now. Well, we know we know that America was built on a pile of skulls, and we know that stuff was stolen, and we know that stuff was acquired unjustly. But what does that mean to us now and our stuff is a really slippery question. Um, uh, I don't know anyone personally who was involved in that particular issue, and yet I have benefited from it. And on the other side, they don't know anyone who particularly was uh, in that issue directly, but they have been hurt by it and things like that. And so, how and to what degree we fix those things is really messy. And it doesn't admit to idealism because there's not one answer for everything. We have to look at history, what was done, how it was done, how recently it was done, etc. And so that is the principle of rectification. Again, he's not giving a ton of details here. Instead, he's just pointing out that if we achieve these three, that is, if we achieve justice in acquisition, justice in transferal, and the principle of rectification of injustice, if those three are met, that is, if the third fixes any failings of the first two, then we have justice in holdings. And if we have that, then we do something wrong by redistributing, by taking away a holding. And so that's thing one. But yeah, the principle of rectification has to be historical, and it can't be time sliced. I think maybe I'll mention his example because I think it's an important and clear one. Imagine we weren't looking at things historically, and we looked around at all the people in the distribution of, say, basic rights, and we say, wait a minute, all of this group of prisoners, people who are in maximum security cells, have fewer rights than the rest of us. That's an injustice that we need to fix. That would clearly be crazy and stupid because we are ignoring history. There is reason that those rights were stripped away. And so he accuses utilitarianism of doing this, and sometimes welfare of doing this. He says that you can't ignore history. You have to look at what the pattern is that led to that distribution. So we have to have a historical principle of rectification in order to determine justice in the real world instead of just the ideal world. And he thinks that's something that certain positions ignore. So the next thing he's going to go to is to kind of draw out what happens when we end up violating this, that there's these certain patterns that will emerge that we ought not interfere with. And if we do, we're doing something wrong. So this is the Wilt Chamberlain example. Now, Wilt Chamberlain played basketball before I was born, so you know it's been a while. But he was so far above all of his competitors, it was ridiculous. This is the only person to ever score 100 points in a single game, and has all these records that are just not going to be touched. So anyway, apparently it was a real treat to watch him. He was in at least one old movie. So there's your background for Wilt Chamberlain. But he says, imagine a situation. Let's simplify and hedge it. Let's say that whatever the correct principle of holdings is, has been met. So imagine everyone has their stuff, and their stuff has been acquired justly. Okay? Whatever you think that means, doesn't matter. But now imagine that somebody decides they want to take some of their holdings, say $1, and pay to watch Wilt Chamberlain play because it's such a treat to watch. And as a result, obviously, I have fewer holdings if I've paid $1 to watch Wilt Chamberlain, and Wilt Chamberlain ends up having a whole lot more. Presumably, I pay him $1, or some portion of it goes to Wilt Chamberlain. And here's the tricky part. What do we do with that now? Because if you say everyone should be equal, that's what you might call a continuous principle. Well, how do you achieve that? Do you say, I'm not allowed to spend my dollar as I see fit? I'm not allowed to give that to Wilt Chamberlain to watch him do whatever? And again, just replace any good or service or overtime. Any voluntary just transfer where my money goes to him for some reason. Could be charity, could be entertainment, could be selfish, whatever. If I have a just beginning, starting point, wherever that starting point is, and I have a just transfer, then it should be just to have this inequality, that I have less and now Wilt Chamberlain has more. And so, because one of two things will have to happen. Either the party who's trying to enforce this continuous principle has to step in and say, no, you're not allowed to pay Wilt Chamberlain to watch him. That would be crazy. And that would be a violation of liberty. But then the other thing you could do is try to correct it after. So everybody's equal, then everybody pays to watch Wilt Chamberlain. Now everybody else has less and Wilt Chamberlain has more. And a coercive power steps in, takes that money back from Wilt Chamberlain and redistributes it. That also seems like a gross violation of liberty because Wilt Chamberlain did something for that money. He achieved it justly. He had a just transfer, and so to step in would be a violation of justice. And so the important issue here is that when we have these patterns, they'll only arise in certain conditions, but to try to fix those to a different pattern, to try to uphold a continuous principle, would require, such as we should all have equal wealth, that's what he means by a continuous principle, we would have to violate liberty with continuous interference. And if it's a just starting point and it's a just transfer, that means Wilt Chamberlain justly has that inequality, which means we are doing an injustice to take it away and to rectify it. So that's the philosophical groundwork behind Nozick's distributive justice. Obviously, he has a lot more to say, and we have a lot more to say about how that transfers to the real world, especially given our need for history. But that's the philosophical backbone. And notice how different it is from Rawls. And so his notion for creating inequalities is very different. It has to do with just transfers. So when you're posting this week, you can do some application and say, well, here's an example of something Nozick would agree with and why, or wouldn't agree with and why, would be good. But you could also post who do you think is closer to a correct account of distributive justice, Rawls or Nozick. Notice you write about both of those in the Distributive Justice Forum. Otherwise, I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and we will talk to you next time.